Okay, we are shifting geographical locations here, moving from Egypt north into the Mediterranean. The culture we'll be looking at in this section is called the Aegean culture, for reasons I'll explain on a later slide. In general, here we just want to get an introduction to the landscape and the region. Of course, we have to start with a map. The Aegean area is defined by the Aegean Sea, the body of water within the Mediterranean that separates modern Greece from modern Turkey. Now let's zoom in on a close-up. The regions around the Aegean Sea define the next culture we want to look at in this class, what we refer to as the Aegean Bronze Age. So here we're looking at the Aegean world. You can see the island of Crete in the south forms a rough southern barrier. You can also see that the Aegean Sea is filled with small islands. This will have some bearing on how culture emerges in this part of the world. The Aegean area saw the rise of civilization around 4000 BCE, and in this section we'll be looking mostly at things from around 3000 to 1000 BCE in a period that we'll call the Aegean Bronze Age. The island group in the middle of the Aegean Sea is called the Cyclades, or the Cycladic Islands, because they are in the shape of a circle. Two things to note about this area. The Cyclades, as well as the other islands in the southern Aegean, means that travel by sea was convenient and not terribly dangerous. You were never more than a few hours away from a shore of some sort, so this was a good practice ground for the Aegean peoples to get their sea legs, which happened very early. A second thing to note, these islands are mountainous, and they have at their core, and often on their surface, some exceptionally high-quality marble. Many of these islands have active quarries, and Greeks mine high-quality marble even today. The importance of this marble is that it gives the Aegean people a pretty good local source of building material, as well as material to carve into objects and statues. Here are two views of an active marble quarry on the Cycladic Islands, in one of the Cycladic Islands today. Okay, let's talk about what we're going to be covering in this module. When we talk about the Aegean world, we're looking at three areas: the Cycladic Islands, the island of Crete, on which the Minoan civilization flourished, and the Greek mainland, where a culture called the Mycenaeans flourished. While there is some overlap, in general it's safe to say that the islands and the Minoans flourished earlier, beginning around 3000 BCE, and by about 1400 BCE, their star had fallen a bit, as it were, and the Mycenaeans became the dominant group in the Aegean. A few words about chronology. I might lose my membership to the Archaeology Club for being so general with this chart, but we can refine this when we get to the upper level classes. For our purposes, I think it's enough to know that all of the Aegean Bronze Age is divided into three parts: early, middle, and late. And each of those correspond very roughly with a culture: Cycladic, Minoan, Mycenaean. As far as I'm concerned, this will work for this class. Were there Minoans in the late Bronze Age? Sure, they didn't disappear completely. But generally speaking, these dates on this slide apply when we're looking at a particular region, especially when that region was flourishing culturally. So in the slides for this section, this is how I'm going to identify and date the monuments we look at. If there's something interesting or problematic about the chronology, I might mention it in my audio, but the dates shown here and the period associations are good enough for me. So what we're looking at here, just so that you know what this image that we've been seeing, is a very distinctive early Bronze Age or Cycladic statuette. It is carved of that abundant marble that I mentioned, and we'll see it again later. I'm starting with a modern ferry map of the Cyclades because it shows the routes between the islands if you ever want to go island hopping in Greece. Several times a day, ferries leave from Athens and head to the various islands. The trips take between maybe 2 hours to 7 or 8, depending on how many islands you stop at before you reach your destination. The convenience of travel by boat between islands that we enjoy today was not unlike the safety and convenience of traveling by boat in the early Bronze Age Aegean. As I mentioned, these islands are made of high-quality marble. Later Greeks will make good use of this marble for large-scale sculpture. During the early Bronze Age, people living on the Cycladic Islands used it for making small sculpture and lamps. Here's an example of Cycladic sculpture, much like the one we saw on the last slide. We'll look at sculpture like this in more detail in a later module. At some point, the culture of the Cyclades seems to have fallen under the influence, or at least the artistic influence, of the booming culture on the island of Crete, known as the Minoans. So by around 1700 BCE, some Cycladic art is starting to look an awful lot like Minoan art. We'll talk about this more in the next module, as well as in a module on Akrotiri, which is one of these Cycladic islands. Let's talk about Crete, that southern island border of the Aegean region. The island of Crete is mountainous with very little arable land. There are no rivers, but there's enough rainfall here to sustain agriculture pretty well. Around 2000 BCE, centers emerge from around the island, enormous architectural complexes that we refer to as palaces. The name of the culture associated with these palaces and all of Crete in the Bronze Age is Minoan, after the legendary and mythological king Minos, who is said to have come from this island. The first writing we have in the Aegean Bronze Age is from Crete, in a script called Linear A. It has not been translated, mostly because very few examples of it are known, so the corpus is small enough and we can't really figure it out yet. A second type of writing is found later on Crete, and it's called Linear B. This script was used both on Crete by the Minoans, as well as on the Greek mainland by the group we call the Mycenaeans. We have a lot more examples of Linear B, and so we have in fact been able to decipher this text. For the most part, the Aegean cultures wrote inventories of goods. For this reason, the Aegean cultures are thought of as proto-historic. In other words, they had writing, but their writings do not give us a good sense of their history, and it's not even really prose. It's mostly just lists. So if you're wondering how many cattle the king had at a particular moment, we might be in good shape, but we have no literature or history from them. For this reason, the information we have about the peoples who populated the Aegean world is really pretty scant. They left us huge palace complexes and some of the most interesting art we have seen up to this point, but we don't really know anything about them. They are completely anonymous. Compare this to the ancient Near East, where cuneiform tablets are very numerous, and we have letters and poetry and other types of writing, including historical writing, that really flesh out these cultures. So the Minoans are less accessible to us because we are lacking in a rich textual tradition. Let's get back to this concept of Minoan palaces. On this map, you can see the breakdown of major archaeological sites from the Minoan culture. Some of the sites are thought to have been religious centers, others are administrative or palatial centers, but there are always religious elements. The palaces really define the Minoans, as we'll see. This map shows only those sites that have been identified as palaces. The most famous one, and the only one we'll look at in the next module, is Knossos. Look at how close together the palaces are. The whole island is only 3,200 square miles. That's somewhere between the size of Delaware and Connecticut. At its thinnest point, from north to south, it's only 7 or 8 miles. This is not a big island, and yet there are these massive architectural complexes separated in some cases by really only a few miles. So why did they need such enormous palaces, which, as we'll see, were used to store food, among other things, and why did they need them so close together? At least the Assyrian palaces were very widespread and were all inhabited by the kings as they traveled around and visited with subjects. But this is literally like having one in Blacksburg and another one in Christiansburg. We don't know the answer to this question, why these palace complexes were so close together. But we might also note that these palaces were unfortified, and at least some were located along the coast, so were presumably involved in some kind of maritime economy. The location of the palaces near the sea, the location of the island within the Aegean, serving as some kind of gateway to the Mediterranean, and lack of good agricultural land, and the theme of some of the paintings decorating the palaces, such as this wall painting of dolphins, all of these things suggest to some that the Minoans were seafarers who made their money, as it were, through fishing and controlling the sea routes around the Aegean. There's not much to go on, although Minoan objects have been found far and wide at this time, so it's clear they were very international in their outlook. This fresco of sea life seems to show a procession of garland-bedecked ships sailing in a procession with dolphins swimming alongside. We don't know the context for this particular scene, but it certainly supports the idea of Minoan culture being very comfortable on the water. If we turn now to the Greek mainland, we encounter a different kind of culture. We'll go into much more detail about the land of mainland Greece in the next section, but in the Aegean Bronze Age, there was a unique culture on the Greek mainland. Unlike Minoan Crete, where we saw a palace culture, on the mainland we have what we call a citadel culture. Mycenaean culture is named after the citadel at Mycenae. There is a palace at this site, but what really characterizes the community is the thick defensive circuit walls that enclose the entire site. The Mycenaeans seem to have been concerned with protection, and this seems to be a concern of all the people living on the Greek mainland during the Late Bronze Age. Later Greeks were fascinated by the people who lived on their land during the Aegean Bronze Age, even though they really understood very little about them. As a result, the later Greeks invented fantastic stories to explain the monuments the Aegean cultures had left behind, such as this view of the walls of Mycenae. The fantastic stories became Greek mythology, and this period, the Bronze Age, was described as being populated by heroic men who were bigger than us and stronger than us. According to the later Greek concept of their past, their ancestors, people like Heracles, Theseus, Achilles, inhabited these elaborate complexes such as Mycenae. We'll talk more about this in the next few modules. One of the most famous stories about this period was the story of the Trojan War. The Trojan War was the 10-year battle fought between the united armies of the mainland citadels, in other words, all of the Mycenaeans, and remember that's the name for everyone living on the mainland, not just the people who lived at the site of Mycenae. So it was all of the united armies of the mainland citadels, and they were fighting against the people of Troy. This war became the foundation for many of the most popular myths in later Greece, and the poet Homer, writing around 700 or 600 BCE, wrote down the stories of two particular episodes associated with the war. The events leading to the death of Achilles during the 9th year of the war — Achilles was the greatest of the heroes to fight at Troy — are told in the Iliad, and the difficulty of one of the heroes, Odysseus, as he tried to make his way home at the end of the war, is told in the poem we call the Odyssey. For the record, I think the Homer Simpson version of the story, if you've ever seen it, if you haven't, I suggest you look it up, but it's about as accurate as the Brad Pitt version of the story. The point I'm trying to make here is that when you think of Greek mythology and stories of men who were stronger than us and could communicate with the gods, etc., well, according to the Greeks who invented these stories, this all happened during the Aegean Bronze Age, the period that we're about to talk about. Okay, so this module hopefully provided you with just a little bit of background to some of the elements that affected the development of art in the Aegean world. We'll talk some more about several of these aspects later on, but hopefully now at least some of the names and terms will be familiar and they've been placed in some kind of rough context.